Daniel, so do flick back to it. And as we start, let me ask you, I wonder whether you would say you are optimistic or pessimistic about the state of the world as you look ahead to the rest of 2024. Looking at the newspaper headlines, I guess it would be easy to feel pessimistic. Britain is involved once again in military action in the Middle East. It seems as though conflict is as close and as present in our world as it has ever been. But maybe some of us are feeling optimistic. Maybe you look ahead and think, well, if we can just get the right people in charge, if we can just, if the elections go in the right way over the rest of the next 12 months, then things will be looking much better as we go through the year or into 2025. I guess part of your answer to that question will simply depend on this. It will depend on who is in charge. It will depend on who you think is in charge, not just of a country or a nation, and not just a politician or a government. Concerned, history just started at some point of history. There's no direction or purpose or meaning to history. All we can do is kind of put our fingers in our ears and make the best of it as we can, and try not to think too hard. The book of Daniel is exilic literature. It's the record of the people of Israel in exile in Babylon. The book is set 700 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, at a time when the nations of Israel and Judah have been conquered by the great Babylonian Empire. Daniel and his friends have been forcibly removed from their home and are living in a country and culture that's entirely dismissive of and hostile towards the God of the Old Testament. Last week, if you were around last week for chapter 1, you'll know that we saw that Daniel was confident in the sovereign rule of God. He knew that God wasn't absent or distant, but God was sovereignly ruling over everything that was going on. And that confidence enabled him to engage with the world that he found himself in, not withdrawing from it or compromising with it. But the question I think that we're left with at the end of Daniel chapter 1 is this: how do we know? How do we know that God really is in charge? How do we know that he rules, especially when it looks like he doesn't? Imagine, just put yourself in Daniel's shoes for a moment. You're in chapter 1, you were a young teenager, maybe 14, 15 years old. You've grown up in Jerusalem, and you've seen at the heart of that city, a great symbol of God's presence in the world, the temple. Maybe you walked past it every day, or you certainly regularly visited it. And then all of a sudden, just in the distance of a few months' time, you find yourself in Babylon, a city that pays no regard whatsoever to God. You know that the temple, that great symbol of God's presence and rule, has been destroyed, that it's been pulled apart, and that the treasures of the temple are now in a great temple in Babylon itself. The God of the Old Testament looks like he's absolutely nowhere. It looks like he can't keep his promises. It looks like his purposes have come to an end entirely. How do you know that God rules? How do you know that he's in charge? How do you keep believing that? Whenever you're reading an Old Testament narrative and trying to work out what's going on with it, a good rule of thumb is to look out for repeated ideas that come up again and again through the narrative, words or ideas that the author wants to bring to our attention and make sure we don't miss. And the repeated idea, the dominant idea of Daniel chapter 2, is the idea of revelation, of something being kind of uncovered or made known. Just as you scan through the narrative, you'll see it repeated time and time again. So verse 11, verse 19, verse 22, verses 28 and 29, verse 30 and verse 47. The idea just keeps coming up again and again and again, as if the author wants to say, notice this, pay attention to the idea of revelation. So how do we know that God is the one who rules history? Well, here is the message of Daniel chapter 2. We can trust the God who reveals. We can trust the God who reveals to establish his kingdom in history. Here's the message of Daniel chapter 2. We can trust the God who reveals things to establish his kingdom in history, because he is the God who reveals. Let's kind of walk through the narrative and just see that worked out as we go. So first, in verses 1 to 13, the author presents us with our need for revelation, our need for revelation. Now, although our head of state wears a crown, not wherever he goes, but certainly on state occasions, like the opening of Parliament. And although he is the centre of attention wherever he goes, our king actually has very little real power. He wears a crown, but the British Constitution limits his actual power, what he can and can't do. So I think we struggle to have a sense of the power and the authority of King Nebuchadnezzar. I suppose he's the kind of head of state who might decide that he's going to call an election for the sake of legitimacy, but he would decide precisely how many votes the opposition would actually receive. 3% probably, to make it look like an actual contest. But he doesn't have a government to constrain him. He doesn't have any official opposition to hold him to account or to interrogate his ideas. No other center of power is permitted to exist in Babylon. There is just King Nebuchadnezzar, and what he says goes. But even the most untouchable tyrants and despots aren't free of doubt and insecurity. And so we meet King Nebuchadnezzar in verses 1 and 2, and King Nebuchadnezzar has a problem. He can't sleep. It's extraordinary, isn't it? He's having some troubling dreams, and the most powerful man in the entire world is tossing and turning at night, deeply troubled and insecure and full of fear. The Babylonians believed that dreams were the gods communicating to them, so he summoned his mages and his sages and his astrologers to his aid, but he's a bit of a canny operator. He suspects that one or two of his kind of court mages might be imposters and frauds, so he's got a cunning plan to sort out the fakes from the real thing. He says to them, not only do I want to know what the interpretation of the dream is, but I want you to tell me what the dream itself actually was. And the stakes are very high. Get it wrong, and you are in for a sticky end. All of the astrologers reply in verse 7, saying, "Oh, your Highness is in rude form this morning. That was a very funny joke. Tell us what the dream is, and we'll interpret it for you." And he says, "No, I'm deadly serious. I want you to tell me what the dream is and what it means. Otherwise, you are all going to die." And at which point, in verse 11, they say, "What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they don't live among humans." And they speak much more truly than they know. In fact, verse 11 might be the truest thing that these advisors have ever said. We know, because we've read to the end of the story, that the dream is all about where history is going. But at this point, before we get even to the dream, the author of Daniel 2 is exposing the inability of human wisdom to really be able to discern what history is all about. That left to our own devices, we're simply incapable of discerning the meaning of history and what our place in it really is. We're entirely adrift, and we have nothing to go on but guesswork. our best shot, our stab in the dark at what might be happening. Does history have a meaning? Does it have a purpose? Well, who knows? Maybe, maybe not. Let me try to illustrate that a little bit like this. Imagine that you've gone for a walking weekend in the Scottish Highlands, and your compass is a bit wonky, so you've got entirely lost as you've been out on your hike. As the day goes on, you realise you've lost your way, and as night draws in, you're really glad when you stumble across a castle that has got some lights on. You kind of approach the castle, not really sure what's going on, but you kind of walk in through a door. It's not the front door, it's like a little back door that you've managed to find. And suddenly you can hear voices coming from a room a bit further down the corridor. You go and stand outside the door. You're listening into these voices, talking to each other, having a conversation. And as that conversation grows clearer and you stop to listen, you realise, to your horror, that you are listening in to 3 or 4 people who are planning to murder someone. What's going on? Have you stumbled across some kind of murder mystery game weekend? Are you genuinely listening in as 3 people are about to commit a crime? Is this a serious thing? Is it a threat to somebody? How are you supposed to tell? They sound deadly serious. They're talking about a list of people that they'd like to get rid of. How are you supposed to know what's going on? And without someone there to tell you what's happening, well, it is simply impossible to know. You see, without a word from beyond, what the king asks is too difficult. No one can know. Who can tell what the meaning of history really is? We need to know that, but particularly as the world around us seems increasingly fragile. What are the domestic and international pressures that have built over not just the last year or 18 months, but over the last decades, that have led to a UK and US bombing campaign in Yemen, of all places, over the past week? Is it a sign of strength? Is it a sign of weakness? Who knows? Who can tell? How do we know? But the author wants us to know that without some kind of word from beyond, without someone to explain and tell us what the meaning of history is, and where nothing to go on but guesswork. But the story moves on, and in verses 14 to 23, we're pointed towards the source of revelation, because if the story stopped at verse 11, it would be a really deeply depressing narrative. We're pointed quickly in verses 14 to 23 towards the source of revelation. There is someone who knows where history is going. Now, news of the situation reaches Daniel. Although he's had nothing to do with the story so far, his head is also on the block. He's considered a wise person in Babylon, so he's in the line of fire just as much as everybody else is. And notice his response in verses 17 to 19. He goes back to his room, he gathers his friends, and he calls them to pray. He calls on his friends to pray, and he urges them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery. And wonderfully, in total contrast to everything that's gone before, in complete contrast to the wisdom of the world that's represented by the mages and astrologers of Babylon, the mystery is revealed by God to Daniel in a vision. And so Daniel responds with praise. Have a look at his hymn of praise in verses 19 to 23 and what he says about God in these verses. He says, verse 20, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. That's a theological truth But notice what he says about God and how he demonstrates his wisdom and power. Verse 21, he is the one who changes times and seasons. He is the one who sets up kings and opposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. Verse 22, he reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. This is the God who Daniel worships. He is the one who is able to reveal all things, who can make hidden things known and bring light even to the deepest darkness. He is the one who rules even over the most powerful-looking tyrants and world leaders. It is this God, the one who can reveal mysteries. It might seem hard for us to believe, given how unstable the world seems, given how disconnected we might feel from international events. But there is a God who is able to reveal hidden mysteries, and that God is the one who is in charge and sovereignly ruling over all things. It might seem hard for us to believe, given maybe how unstable we feel our own lives are. Maybe personally, we struggle to make sense of our own history. We struggle to make sense of where the Lord has brought us and what's going on in our own hearts and in our own lives at the moment. Or maybe we simply struggle to connect with the wider story of history. We're aware that there's all this stuff going on in the world at the moment, and we just don't seem to have any place in it. Maybe we've struggled to see any sense of meaning in the world, a transcending narrative of where history is going, or maybe we just don't know how personally we connect with that narrative. But the message of Daniel 2 is that there is a God who speaks a word from outside history and who can reveal those things to us, who does have a purpose for the world, for you in the world, for me in the world. And of course, that is profoundly good news. That is profoundly wonderful, liberating news. And here's why. So come back for a moment to the castle that you've accidentally found yourself in the Scottish Highlands. You're standing next to a door, and you can hear those voices on the other side of the door plotting a murder. What do you do? Do you push on the door and go in to find out what's going on? Do you maybe just quietly turn around and walk back down the corridor because actually you don't really want to find out what's happening, and there might really be a murderous gang of rogues on the other side of the door who are about to add your name to their list? There's good reason not to walk through the door. Or it might be that you walk through the door and find that there is a director who yells, "Cut!" and berates you for ruining all the hard work that's gone into getting this scene of the traitors just right, with their kind of cameramen and sound technicians everywhere. Either way, you're going to lose, aren't you? If you push on that door and you walk through it, either to find that you look like an idiot for ruining the scene, or that you're about to die. Either way, you lose, unless there's someone who can tell you what's going on. Unless there's a very kind showrunner or a sound tech who can tell you that you're on the set of the hit BBC TV show The Traitors, and that actually your path home is just through the fields over there on the way that you have come. You see, unless there's someone there who can tell you what's going on and explain your situation to you, you just don't know what to do. But the good news of Daniel 2 is that we don't need to fear either looking like an idiot or losing our lives for fearing to push on the door. Because there is a God who can reveal. Because there is a God who has got the wisdom to know and the power to act. See, maybe you're skeptical about the ability of, about your own ability to work out what's going on in your own life or in the world. Maybe you're skeptical about anyone's ability to know what's going on in the world. You're skeptical about politicians or philosophers or whoever it might be, to actually be able to discern to the very heart of history and to work out what's going on. And if you're skeptical about human ability, you're totally right to be. But there is a God who really did live among the humans. There is a God who reveals. There is a God who is there and who speaks. There is a God who has spoken definitively through his Son, who speaks into our confusion and into our fears, who can reveal hidden things and hidden depths to us so that we might know how to live for him in his world, in the world that he has made, in a way that makes a difference, not just day to day, but to history itself. And lastly, let's look at the content of Revelation as we see where the story has been kind of building towards and pointing us towards as we think about what it means to live for this God who speaks. I don't want to spend much time on the dream or the interpretation. You won't be surprised to hear that scholars have spent years, decades, millions of gallons of ink trying to work out exactly who might be in view through Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Basically, the four metals of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees are thought to represent four great empires. It might be that they represent Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But whether or not that's right, I don't think it hugely matters. The point of the dream, and the thing that we need to notice, is verse 44. Have a look at verse 44. In the time of those kings, Daniel says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those previous kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. You see, there is one kingdom that will outlast any other. The kingdom that God himself will establish. The hope that Daniel and his friends would have heard in their time of exile in Babylon, I think, is the hope of the rock. That small rock that Daniel talks about in the dream back in verse 35. The rock that strikes the statue and then becomes a huge mountain and fills the whole earth. It's a promise that the exile won't last forever. It's a promise that God's purposes for his people will be fulfilled, that he hasn't forgotten his people or what he's going to do in history. And we heard Jesus' words in Mark chapter 1 this morning. The kingdom of God is near. Repent and believe the good news. The kingdom that Daniel looked forward to finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Daniel chapter 2 tells us, and Jesus Christ tells us, that the meaning of history is found in God establishing his rule, in God establishing his kingdom in history through the resurrection and through the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ, and that every other kingdom, no matter how great it seems, no matter how powerful and impressive it seems, the greatest kingdoms of the world, Babylon, Persia, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, even our own personal kingdoms that we are looking to build, will ultimately submit to the reign of Jesus Christ. His is the kingdom that will outlast any other, that won't be shaken by anything else. Which tells random. I think that's probably a deep-seated fear that many maybe of us have this morning. Certainly I think many of the people who we live amongst would have. That history has got no real meaning or purpose, that it is just random, that we are just a collection of kind of carbon on a rock hurtling through space, and everything's entirely accidental. There's nothing or no one in charge or directing or making any decisions. But Daniel chapter 2 tells us that that's not the case. That despite appearances, even if we struggle to make sense of it, even if we can't plumb the depths of why X is happening to Y and what's happening in our world, history is not random. That Jesus Christ is establishing his kingdom. And one day his kingdom will be the one that outlasts any other. What does that mean for us personally as we close? Well, I guess it means at least this. Daniel chapter 2, Jesus Christ give us the big picture of what God is doing in his world. They give us the big picture of what God is doing in history. But it doesn't mean that we know how exactly that's working out day to day and how each and every twist and turn of our own lives might fit into that bigger picture. And it might be that circumstances that you are going through at the moment seem completely at odds with God's purposes. God's establishing his kingdom in history, and you hear that and think, great, but it doesn't feel like that in my heart and life. It doesn't look like that in the world around me. In fact, it looks like the opposite. It looks like things are going wrong and things are harder than they have ever been. But as we look at Daniel chapter 2 this morning, maybe the message that we need to grasp, if that's us, is this. Perhaps we need to resist the temptation to try to probe and understand each and every last twist and turn of our own lives and hearts. Where we see something kind of going on and we're not quite sure how it fits, maybe we need to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions with it and say, well, definitively, therefore, God can't rule. Or absolutely, it cannot be possible that God is in charge because I can see X going on and it doesn't make any sense to me at all. And the reason is simply this. The cross of Calvary didn't look much like God establishing his rule. In fact, it looked like the end. It looked like the end of God's purposes as Jesus died alone, completely abandoned by his friends, betrayed by those closest to him. And yet that's precisely what was going on. That's precisely the point at which God was establishing his rule and his kingdom and his purpose in history. He really is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. He really is the one who will establish his kingdom forever. So even when we can't see that day to day, Daniel chapter 2 is an invitation to trust God and his purposes for us and for our world.